You're listening to the New Hope Church podcast. To learn more about what we're doing on the south side of Indianapolis, you can check us out online at becomehope.com. If you like what you're hearing here, be sure you check out one of our companion podcasts. We have a daily devotional podcast called Let's Find Out Together, as well as an apologetics podcast called Salty Saints. Let's listen in as today's talk comes from Randy Spade.
Well, good morning. Great to have you here. I hope you're having a great holiday. My name is Randy. I'm one of the pastors here at New Hope. So far in this series, talking about Advent, we have looked at the candle of Jesus' presence. And we've talked about his incarnation. Last week, we lit the candle of Jesus' light. We saw that Jesus gives us light in the darkness. And today, we light the candle of Jesus' kingship. Now, September read a passage to us, and it's not a common Christmas passage. It's from Romans chapter 1. In this passage, Paul tells us that Jesus is in the line of David. Jesus was born one of the descendants going all the way back to David. It's important to know that. Jesus was a king. He was in the line of David. He was a king. In fact, that's why the Magi came to worship him. They came and said, "Where's the King of the Jews? Where's the one who was born as a king?" Today, we light the candle of Jesus' kingship. And today we want to kind of dig a little bit deeper in on that. What does that even mean, the fact that Jesus is king? To understand it, we really have to go back to the beginning of David's kingship. When Samuel anointed David as king of Israel, he's just a shepherd. He was the last son of a fairly insignificant family. He was the smallest, the least important. But look at what the Lord said. 2 Samuel. There we go. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture. I selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you've gone. I've destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I'll make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time. Your throne will be secure forever. That's pretty amazing. From that time, God promised that David's line would last forever. Throughout the Old Testament, he repeats that promise. I looked it up at least 10 different times. God says to David, your line is eternal. It'll last forever. Now the prophets picked up this theme. Isaiah, that would have been around the 700s, said, a child is born to us. A son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders. He'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. He lasts forever and ever. About 200 years later, Jeremiah picks up the very same thing in Jeremiah chapter 23. The time is coming, says the Lord, when I'll raise up a righteous descendant from King David's line. He'll be a king who rules with wisdom. He'll do what's just and right throughout the land. This will be his name. The Lord is our righteousness. And then just a little bit later, maybe 50 or 80 years later, Ezekiel, now prophesying from Babylon, says this: my servant David will be their king. They'll have only one shepherd. They'll obey my regulations and be careful to keep my decrees. They'll live in the land that I gave my servant Jacob, the land where their ancestors lived. They and their children and their grandchildren after them will live there forever, generation after generation. My servant David will be their prince forever. I'll make a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting covenant. I'll give them their land and increase their numbers. I'll put my temple among them forever. I'll make my home among them. I'll be their God. They'll be my people. When my temple is among them forever, the nations will know that I am the Lord who makes Israel holy. Now, we come to the New Testament and the same thing happens. In fact, the opening words of the New Testament is this. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. And Matthew then gives a shortened genealogy. Now, he shortens it so that there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, when the line of David stopped reigning, and then 14 generations from the Babylonian exile to the birth of Jesus, when the line of David picks up again and begins to reign again. Interesting. Even Jesus' genealogy focuses on the fact that that Jesus comes from the line of David. The question is why? Why is it so important to say that Jesus comes from the line of David? Well, the most obvious thing, Jesus is a king. That's why we have the candle of Jesus' kingship. In fact, after the Old Testament, in the literature that's written between the Old Testament and the New Testament, one of their favorite titles for the Messiah is to call him King Messiah. Now, if you've watched The Chosen, you will hear them frequently talk about King Messiah. That's very historical. That is exactly what they did. Matthew picks up on that. He continues that line of thought after the genealogy, when he has the Magi who come and ask Herod, where is the king of the Jews? They went to Herod because they thought it must be Herod's son. He's the current king. So let's go honor his new son. When Herod said, I don't have a son, they said, oh. And realized that the new king was actually going to depose Herod. Well, not at that time, but he certainly did later. So why all this emphasis on Jesus as king? Is it just another way of saying Jesus is really, really important? Is it just another way of saying that Jesus is really awesome? Well, yeah, but there's more to it than that. I'm convinced that there's quite a lot more to it than that. And to understand that, I think we have to go all the way back to the first king and queen that existed. Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. The Lord looks at Adam and Eve and says, rule. Rule over the creation that you've given us. Rule over the plants, the animals. Rule and govern wisely. That's something that a king does. That a king and queen would do. But you know the story. They sinned. They messed it all up. And when the Lord approached them and said, what did you do? They said, well, it was the serpent. So the Lord looks at the serpent. And he says this. I'll put hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. That is really strange when you look at it. What in the world is he talking about there? I think he's talking about more than an intrinsic hatred that most of us have for snakes. I see a snake and I'm long gone. I'll turn and run the other way. There's something about them that just I don't want to deal with. So I choose to walk the other way, to get out of the way. But I think there's more than that here. In fact, God's curse, although it mentions the animal, the serpent, says you'll crawl on your belly, I think this part of the curse is not directed so much at the animal as it is the deceiver behind the animal. There will be hostility between God's children and the children of the deceiver. The deceiver will continually try to trip up those who are following the Lord. The curse goes on. You will strike his heel. You will injure him. He will crush your head. He puts an end to you. It's interesting that as we come to the New Testament and we begin to look at the couple of references that Paul makes to Jesus as coming from the line of David. One September read for us, Romans 1, it's actually verse 4, in his earthly life, Jesus was born into King David's family line. And he was shown to be the Son of God when he was raised from the dead. Now later on in 2 Timothy says, always remember that Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of King David, was raised from the dead. These are the only two times that Paul talks about Jesus as coming from the line of David. And both times he says he was raised from the dead. Jesus came and he died. God told the serpent, you'll strike his heel. This is the serpent, the deceiver, Satan, striking his heel. Because you see, Jesus died a very real death, a very painful death. But ultimately, it was just an injury because he rose from the dead. He came back to life. And then at the end of all things, if we jump forward and look at the book of Revelation, we begin to understand the meaning of the phrase, he will crush your head. In the book of Revelation, 18 chapters are spent talking about the problems that we all face, the trials, the tribulations, the testing, and finally the kings of the earth, multiple, plural, all of the kings of the earth gathered together to battle against Jesus. They struck his heel. They injured him. Now the kings of the earth are coming together to do him in for good. And then I saw the heaven opened, and a white horse standing there. Its rider was named Faithful and True, for he judges fairly and wages a righteous war. From his mouth came a sharp sword to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron rod. He'll release the fierce wrath of God, the Almighty, like juice flowing from a winepress. On his robe, at his thigh, was written this title: King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Now John's looking out, and he's seeing all of the kings of the world gathered together. But when he sees the white rider and the name on his robe, it says, of all of these kings, this is the kingiest. This is the most regal of all of them. This is the king, the king of all of the kings. And then we catch the meaning of the phrase, he will crush your head, because all of the kings have gathered to battle. He opens his mouth, a sword comes out, and the battle's done. There's no fight. There's no fight to be had. He is that kingly. He opens his mouth, and the fight's over. In fact, the next verse, an angel comes down and says, vultures, come and feast on the carnage. See, the fact that Jesus is king, I think, is more than just saying he's awesome, he's important. I think what Paul is saying when he says that he is from the line of David, I think what John is saying when he says this is the King of all kings, I think they're looking at the incredible, immense story of salvation that starts in the Garden of Eden with the sin of Adam and Eve. When God said, okay guys, I wanted you to rule. You've messed that up. So I'm going to send my own son. He'll show you what it means to rule. He'll show you what it means to be a king. That story of salvation starts in Eden. Goes all the way through the Old Testament. David, horribly flawed man. But the one thing that he did is he always came back to God. Even after he sinned, he came back to God and said, "Forgive me. I've sinned. I don't deserve this." Out of David's line came Jesus. And at the beginning of the New Testament, we see Jesus born in a manger, worshipped as a king. Until we come to the very end of all times. From Eden to Armageddon, Jesus is king. God sent his son. His son was born, recognized as a king, but he died a very real death. Satan struck him. Satan struck the Son of God on the heel. The Son of God had to be born in order to save us. The Son of God had to die in order to save us. Satan struck the Son of God on his heel. But the Son of God rose from the dead, and he is coming again to crush Satan's head. At that time, we enter God's eternal kingdom. So I focus on David's line. It describes Jesus as a king, tells us that Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecies. It identifies Jesus as a human, as one of us. He was born in poverty. He died a very real death. But it identifies Jesus as God. He rose from the dead. And then it finishes the great story of salvation from Eden all the way to Armageddon. Jesus is King. That's what that phrase means. He fulfills the great story of salvation. The kingly Son of God who comes to bring us salvation. He fulfills the promise that the deceiver's power would be temporary. The deceiver would no longer have control over us. We would be free to live under Jesus' kingship. That's what it means when we say Jesus is King. So today, why does Jesus' kingship matter at all to us? Think back about what you've heard over the past 20 minutes. What stood out to you about this great story of salvation from Eden to Armageddon? All of us need to answer the question, have you made Jesus the King of your life? Is he the King? Is he in charge? If you're like me, I have to answer that question. Yeah, kinda. Because every once in a while there's something in my life that I just want control over. Well, what about you? What is there in your life that you need to surrender to your King? Who can you talk to? Who can hold you accountable to do just that? Pray with me, would you? Now, Lord, most of us here want to be able to answer, yes, you are King of my life. But most of us here have that thing or those things that we still want to keep for ourselves. Show us, Lord. Show us what those things are, and help us to relinquish control of those things to the King, so that you can control us totally and fully. We ask it, Lord, in your name. Amen.
Thanks for tuning in to the New Hope Church podcast. If you would do us a favor and like or subscribe on your favorite platform, we would really appreciate it. Also, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at questions@becomehope.com. Have a great week, and know that we are praying for you as you seek to be Jesus in every corner of your world.